of animals and plants occurring on islands that were explored by the Beagle, he would find that if you went to a group of islands, you would often find on different islands species that were similar enough to obviously be related to each other, and yet different enough to be considered species. And furthermore, these species occurring on islands would often resemble a species that was yet different again occurring on the mainland. Now, probably the most celebrated example of this is a closely related group of bird species, now collectively known as Darwin's finches, that occur on the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean, about 700 kilometers off the coast of Peru. The different islands of the Galapagos differ considerably in their size and in their habitat. And each island habitat has a different species that appears to be uniquely suited for that habitat. In particular, these species differ largely in the size and shape of their beaks, and they use their beaks in different ways to feed on different kinds of material. For example, there are some species with very large beaks that appear to be suitable for crushing large, hard seeds. Other species have smaller beaks that are more suitable for handling smaller seeds. In fact, some species will have slender gracile beaks that are more suited for picking insects off plants. And indeed, the size and shape of the different beaks of this group of Darwin's finches did correspond to what Darwin observed about their feeding ecology. Now, Darwin wondered, how is it possible that you would have species on different islands that were similar and yet so clearly different, and that the differences related so clearly to the environments in which those species lived? This pattern made perfect sense to Darwin if the various species were all descended from the same common ancestor, presumably an ancestor that had come from the mainland species that appeared similar to these island species. And if all of the island species had gradually evolved and diversified in a way that matched the habitats in which they lived. Darwin called this pattern descent with modification. And what we mean today by descent with modification is the idea that a group of species will have radiated from some single common ancestor, sharing similarities in common with each other and with that ancestor reflecting that common descent. Okay, Darwin spent 5 years going around the world collecting animals and plants and making observations like this. He returned from his trip in 1836, loaded with specimens and notebooks of his observations. And he spent more than 20 years actually working on what he called the species problem. During the time that he was working on this problem, he spent most of his time in his country estate in England. He was no longer going to travel. In fact, Darwin became quite ill, and it's thought that he might have developed a disease that he picked up on his ocean voyage. Chagas's disease has been mentioned. But he nonetheless continued to amass evidence by talking to naturalists who were collecting plants and animals from other parts of the world, and especially by looking at the effects of domestication on species. Evidence that convinced him that, not only convinced him that evolution occurs, but also suggested to him a particular mechanism by which evolution could occur. Darwin proposed this mechanism, the theory of natural selection, as early as 1844. He wrote a paper in 1844, 8 years after his return from the Beagle voyage, but he never published that paper. He was urged by friends and colleagues to publish it. Even his wife was urging him to publish it, although she knew that this theory might have a major impact on their lives because of the controversy that it could raise. But Darwin preferred instead to perfect his ideas. He didn't want to propose this idea until he had amassed so much evidence that the idea simply could not be refuted. And so he, in fact, spent another 10 or more years revising his ideas, revising his writing, collecting more specimens, evaluating more data. Darwin's hand was forced, however, in 1858 when he received a manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a well-known naturalist, somebody who Darwin had been corresponding with, working in what is now Malaysia and Indonesia. Wallace's manuscript essentially presented the same idea of natural selection that Darwin had been working on for 20 years. And Wallace asked Darwin to submit this manuscript he sent for publication. I would imagine that Darwin was thunderstruck. He wrote to his friend Charles Lyell, who was now a close colleague. Remember, Lyell was the geologist, a close colleague and friend of Darwin's now, asking him for advice about what to do. Lyell arranged for Wallace's paper and for an excerpted synopsis of Darwin's 1844 manuscript, which Lyell had seen long ago, to be published simultaneously, giving credit for the discovery of the theory of natural selection to both men. Darwin then quickly finished the book-length version of his ideas that he had been working on for years, which was published the following year in 1859 with the title On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Now, the essential observations behind the theory of natural selection are very straightforward. So let's review them now. Darwin was struck by three things. First, he was struck by how much variation he observed among individuals of the same species. Of course, individuals of a species all look alike, but no two were exactly alike. Darwin also recognized that some of this individual variation is passed on from parents to offspring. That is, Darwin observed that traits are heritable. Darwin didn't know the mechanism responsible for this. Remember, that's the kind of problem that Mendel had as well. But he argued that a mechanism must exist. Darwin's next important observation was that most species produce more offspring than ever survive. Now, in this, Darwin was influenced by the writings of Thomas Malthus, who was an economist who, around the turn of the 19th century, wrote an essay arguing that much of human suffering, including famine and homelessness, disease, and so forth, was inevitable as the result of the fact that the human population would always grow faster than the available resources needed to support it. In other words, Malthus argued that the size of the human population is limited by competition. And Darwin saw that this was true in animals and plants as well. Now, these observations led Darwin to the following conclusions. First, he concluded that given that more individuals are born in a population than can ever live, there must be competition for limited resources so that only some of those individuals are going to survive and eventually reproduce. Second, because individuals in a population differ in their characteristics, not all individuals are expected to be as successful in this competition. Particularly individuals with the most favorable variations, that is, individuals having traits that make them more successful in the prevailing environment in this competition, will be more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. Therefore, these naturally selected individuals, as Darwin called them, will contribute more offspring to later generations. They will breed more. And finally, if the traits that contributed to the success of the parents are heritable, what we would say today is genetically heritable, then over time there will be more individuals possessing those traits than other traits, because the individuals with those traits have produced more offspring who inherit genetically the propensity to produce those same traits. We call traits that evolve this way adaptations, and so over time natural selection is thought to cause populations to change their characteristics in such a way that will increase adaptation to the prevailing environment. As I said, the first edition of Darwin's book was published in 1859, actually in November of that year, and all 1,000 copies that were originally printed were sold on the first day. People knew this idea was coming and they were eager to digest it. You can imagine the book created a major stir in Victorian England, as Darwin and some of his friends and wife had feared, largely because his theory was very quickly extended to humans, which was a very challenging thing. Darwin's idea also challenged the literal interpretation of the Bible and suggested that the hand of God, per se, was not necessary to account for all features of nature. In spite of this initial controversy, however, Darwin's work, which actually was not only The Origin, but many other books to follow, eventually held sway on one point, the fact that evolution occurred. And in fact, Darwin came to be considered one of the most famous and celebrated scientists of his day. For example, he was buried in Westminster Abbey in London and eulogized by the Archbishop of the Church of England when he died in 1882. By the end of the century, pretty much everyone accepted the idea that evolution occurs. Next time, we're going to take a look at a couple of examples of evolution in natural populations to explore this idea in a little more detail.